So you've just finished recording a record, it's been mixed, and, well, you can't quite release it yet because it still needs to be mastered. So what the hell is mastering and why is it so important? Well, put shortly, mastering is when you take the final master recording, when everything's been bounced down to a simple stereo mix, and you apply compression, limiting, EQ to that mix to get the final master. But what's the point of doing this? Why is it important? Does it really make that much difference? And should I be spending a lot of money on it, or could I just do it myself? Well, today we're going to look at that, and we're actually going to interview one of the world's leading mastering engineers, Adam Ayan, who I was very lucky to have master my own record, Under an Empty Sky. So one of the quickest ways we can see how much difference mastering makes is to compare my mixes to my masters. So let's take one of my songs here. We've got the unmastered mix at the top and the final master at the bottom. Let's switch back and forth in real time between the two so you can hear the difference. Starting with the unmastered mix.
Where do we go? How do we find a North Star in the sky that's empty? Where do we go when we've already come so far? Maybe this is plenty. And how can you love me when you don't know why?
Now, as you can hear, there's not a massive difference there, and it shouldn't be. Mastering doesn't make a massive night and day difference to your music. It's almost like a final sheen, a final coat of veneer on your music. You can see from the waveforms that it certainly got louder, and that's one of the main things that mastering is trying to achieve, is getting it up to a good volume, a good consistent volume. But it's not just the final volume that's changed with the mastering. It's also got a slightly clearer sound, less mud. It's more glued together. It's more cohesive. It sort of just ties everything together.
Maybe we're done with the past this time. Maybe we're done with the past.
Now, when a mastering engineer masters an album, they are trying to give the album a consistent sound, a consistent tone and glue, but they're also paying attention to how each track has a different character. Some tracks will be quieter and more laid back, and some will be bigger and bolder. So let's have a listen to one of the more quiet tracks on my album to see how much difference the mastering made.
Pack up the boxes. I'm gonna sell this house. I find what I will find.
For me, at least on my album, it was these quieter tracks where the mastering made a lot more difference. It brought everything together a lot more. Maybe because there was less elements there in the first place, the mastering can really do its job and glue it all together. Whereas on some of my bigger tracks, like Hold Your Breath, which has loads of elements going on, there's almost no discernible difference between the master and the mix. You know, there is a difference there, you can hear if you listen carefully, but it's really hard to detect.
Hold your breath.
So that's the basics of what mastering is. But now let's talk to Adam Ayan, who has mastered Paul McCartney, Taylor Swift, Queen, Father John Misty, the Foo Fighters, the Rolling Stones, Bruce Springsteen. Let's talk to him about what mastering is and what it really means. I want to demystify mastering a bit.
Sure.
And the first question really is, what is mastering and how is it different from just mixing?
Sure. Yeah, I describe mastering as the final creative step in the process of making a record. And it also is the first step in digital distribution and manufacturing. But on the creative side of things, it's the ability to take the final mix and just do final sonic enhancements and make the record sound as best as it possibly can. And that means different things to different people. It's subjective, just like mixing is. But I work always directly from the stereo mix. So I do not have the ability to make the kind of changes I make on a track per track basis. It's on a mix by mix stereo mix basis. And generally speaking, using equalization as one of my main tools in the toolbox, and then dynamics processing, which would be compression limiting, is one of the others, to take what's already, most of the time a really great mix and then make it even that much better, make it translate really well, in every environment, every way that the consumers are going to listen to it.
So yeah, you mentioned EQ and things like limiters and compressors.
That's right.
Is there any other tools you might reach for? Any other plugins, that sort of thing?
I mean, on a regular basis, I use a lot of, I use the Isotope RX a lot. So I will do some noise cleanup. That's super common, whether it's, often you hear a lot of mouth ticks, especially in pop music where the lead vocal is so present, so upfront, so compressed. There are things that get by even in the mixing phase that I can then remove with RX or other tools like it. Even pops and clicks or digital pops and clicks, those kinds of things. So that's really common. Aside from that, other types of effects, like say for instance reverb, is something I almost never ever use.
Makes sense.
There have been occasions where I've used it, but it's not the kind of thing I would normally apply to an entire mix. Same goes for things like, special effects like chorus delay, all these other things that are really useful on the individual track level when you're mixing are not useful at all in mastering. So it's mostly equalization. And I, generally speaking, will use on any given session a minimum of 2 or 3 equalizers that all, sound different from each other to do the shaping the way I want it to be, and dynamics processing. And then aside from that, it's really special case, if anything else comes out of the toolbox.
Yeah. Do you feel like when you're mastering, is there always just sort of one obvious direction to go in, or do you actually kind of have choices to make stylistically when you master?
I think there's always choices to make. Generally speaking, there's one direction that always feels just right to me. But as I'm doing all of that, calculating that in my head and making the moves and making the changes, it's really based on how the song itself and the recording itself speaks to me. And that can also, what can come to play there also is genre. But then if I send it off to the client and they say, well, I wish it was a little more this way or that way, there's a window of what I would consider good subjectivity where we can make changes and still end up with something that sounds amazing, even if it wasn't my first instinct.
So as you mentioned, when you master, you've just got the final mix. You've not got the individual stems. Right. But is there a reason? Is it perhaps historical or practical that the role of mastering falls to someone different than the mix? Why can't the mixer just do those things?
Sure. No, it's a really great question. And the short answer is the mixer could, if they wanted to, absolutely. Some mixers do. They're few and far between. Most mixers that I work with and I know are happy to pass it off to a mastering engineer. And I think the reason being, in my experience of the, almost 30 years I've been doing this, is mixing and mastering are two very different disciplines. And so there are, you think about the time a really good mixer or recording engineer puts into their craft. There are tens of thousands of hours that make them really good at what they do. They haven't put that into mastering, and vice versa. But I'd also add to that, there are a couple of other things that are really important. Number one, perspective. So when I master a record, generally speaking, the day I master it's the first time I've ever heard any of it, right? The first time I've heard a single note of that record, that affords me the ability to have kind of a clean slate and have no perspective on what got it to that point in the mix. So in other words, you as an artist have written the songs, you've come up with an arrangement, you've performed them, all the different parts, you have other musicians perform with you, you've got somebody recording, mixing, all that way through that process. You might have some things that have come up for you, whether it's, some tracks that you've struggled with to make sound great, or some that you just, right off the bat, you were really happy with, but you have all these preconceived notions of what's gone on in that entire process. I don't know any of that. And there's actually, a lot of upside to that in the mastering world, because I can just sit and hit play and then hear what it sounds like to me and do what instinctually feels right to me to make it better without having any preconceived notions. So that's a really big part of it, is perspective. And then the other, on the more practical side, is I consider my studio a benchmark, acoustically, sonically, everything. When I hit play, I'm hearing the recording exactly as it exists. I've, very painstakingly have gone through the process of building this studio about 1.5 years ago now, and doing so in such a way that what comes out of the speakers is extremely neutral. The room's not coloring the sound. The speakers are not. They're extremely neutral and balanced. Everything down to the cables have been purposely selected. And especially given this day and age where most records are made in a variety of environments, Go back 30 years ago, maybe you would have sat in one studio the entire time to record and mix your record with an engineer and a producer. And that was a studio that, was maybe a legendary commercial studio, great acoustics, the whole thing. Those are fewer and far between, the studios themselves and those situations. So more than ever, having a sonic benchmark is super important somewhere in the process. And it's almost traditionally always fallen to mastering. So that's another real practical reason why you would use a professional mastering engineer.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, we mentioned how you don't have control over the stems, but are there instances where you're hearing a problem and the only practical way to solve that problem would be to go back to the mixer and say, actually, could you adjust this?
Yeah, certainly there are plenty of times where that comes up where I can't, there are certain things that I can do actually and fix more things than you would even imagine with just a stereo mix. But of course, there are things that just can't be fixed, right, without going back into the tracking. So in each situation, every session is a little bit different. And especially being at the very end of the process, you have to be extremely careful how and when you bring things like that up.
Yeah.
You want to be sure the mixer, the producer, the artist are all receptive to that kind of feedback. You don't want to throw a huge monkey wrench or throw everybody's confidence off balance in the 11th hour. And oftentimes in the mastering phase, you are in the 11th hour and there's very little wiggle room for extra time to do things. So there are certainly instances where I'm like, gosh, I really wish I could change this or that. It is a mix thing. If I know what the situation is, if I know the mixer, if I know the artist and the producer well enough, I'll bring those things up. Otherwise, I'll, do the best I can do to fix them. You definitely want to have the right tact and diplomatic approach if you're going to bring that kind of thing up.
How long would you say it takes you to master a track? And do you purposefully do it over a few days to make sure you've got sort of a fresh pair of ears?
No, generally speaking, I do it, aside from any revisions that might come along the way, I do it the first time, send it off for one song, typical 3 to 4 minute pop song, 30 minutes tops. If it takes me longer to do the job than that, then there's a problem with the mix, and that just means I'm digging in more, and that's fine too. But generally speaking, it's about 30 minutes. The song is mastered. Again, I like to work off my instincts, so I don't want to belabor those instincts. I want to, go with what feels right to me. And then from there, the process becomes the client gets to listen to it. And if they, at that point, sometimes they might want to send a new mix where they made a few adjustments. They might ask me to make a few adjustments, that sort of thing. That might take another 15 minutes, half hour, but it's an extremely quick process. And if it goes longer, then something's up.
You mentioned mastering is sort of the last stage before distribution. And part of that is the different formats, because obviously we have digital, but we also have vinyl and CD and other things. People have said to me before about how vinyl in particular, you have to be careful mastering because apparently if it's sort of too dynamic, for example, the needle can even jump out of the groove. Is that something you actually, is it as serious as that with master? Can you just whack a digital master on a vinyl, or does it have to be particularly tailored to that medium?
It's a really great question. The short answer is yes. And I would say a lot of records I've done over the years that end up on vinyl, it's one master. So we've mastered it at high res. That's what's going to be used for digital, distro, CD, and vinyl. That said, there are things you can do differently for vinyl and make it a unique and a better and special experience. And I have found a lot of clients for the past couple of years have been really hip to doing that. And that usually means making it more dynamic. Generally speaking, means using less limiting and compression, which affords the ability to get a better cut, slightly better cut on the disc itself, which means better fidelity, but also a unique and better vinyl experience than just slapping the digital on it. Though, a lot of records are being done that way, and there's certainly a lot I've mastered that have been done that way. The issues, those mechanical issues they absolutely exist. It's absolutely true. Generally speaking, it's if the level is too hot and or the bass response is too much. Also, something that comes more into the mixing phase is you're much better off keeping all your bass information in the center, in between the left and the right. So straight up with a pan pot, that's where you'd have your kick and your bass guitar, for example, your 808, your anything with a low end. But that's traditionally how we make pop records anyways. There are very few that go outside of that realm. If you start to put a lot of heavy bass on, say hard left or hard right on one channel, that can get a little funky for the grooves as well. So generally speaking, you can use the digital master so long as it's not too hot or too bass heavy. Also, or I should also say too bright. Over brightness and especially sibilance are bad for cutting vinyl, and I usually chase that down for digital anyways, because I don't like overly bright things. I don't like, if I get something where the singer is very sibilant, actually, and this goes back to your almost initial question, one thing I hadn't mentioned is in that dynamics processing realm, I use de-essing quite often. And that not only that's good for the vinyl, because that's going to need to happen. If you have too much of that spitty, like 4 to 8K range, it's going to cause problems. And some cutting engineers may even have to do more de-essing down the line if it's too much for them. But generally speaking, I do that in the digital world as well, because I think that can be better. And I never like anything strident in the upper mid-range or the brightness area. It comes off as kind of impressive at first. And then after a while, it's like, I can hear that top end. I don't need it to be piercing.
Yeah. So with the tools you're using with mastering, you mentioned just de-essers just then, EQ, compression, limiters. Are you generally setting a certain level and then that's it for the whole track, or do you automate it to different moments of the song?
Yeah, I definitely use automation in a lot of different ways when it's needed. Absolutely. And that's certainly for level. If I need to automate EQs, anything like that, 100%. So it's very rare actually that from beginning to end, it's just one dynamic setting for everything. It's actually more common one static setting. It's actually more common that I'm making changes from beginning to end based on what's most applicable to any part of the song and making the whole sound the best that it can.
Yeah, well, it was an absolute pleasure having you master my record as well.
My pleasure, man.
I feel very honoured for you to have done that, and it's been great talking as well. Mastering is definitely, well, at least from where I sit, it feels a bit of a dark art, a sort of a mysterious sort of process. So yeah, thank you for casting some light on that.
Absolutely, my pleasure. That's been the way I've heard that so many times over the years from clients, friends, people in the industry, and I'm always happy to demystify it a bit. So thanks for having me on, David. This was fun.
So a massive thank you to Adam for not only mastering my album, but taking the time to chat to me about what mastering involves. Now, my final thing I wanted to mention is that, of course, mastering makes a big difference, but it's not always essential to get somebody else to master your music. It can be a really valuable opportunity to get a fresh pair of ears on it, but for smaller projects, you can master your own music using tools like Isotope Ozone. If I'm recording a piece of music for one of my YouTube videos, say, and I'm not actually planning on putting it out on streaming or something like that, I won't pay someone to master it. I'll just do a basic master myself, getting the essential things sorted, like getting the volume up to a good consistent level using a limiter, or maybe just sort of controlling some of the lower frequencies with a EQ or a multiband compressor.
Will you do? Will you let me out? Will you let me in? Will you let me down before?
So don't feel like you're getting priced out of making music if you can't afford mastering, but then do consider getting a mastering engineer involved if your project is a bit more important to you and you want it to do the very best that it can.
I remember the evening roar, clear as a bell.